Chapter 1. The Roommate Who Talks to Himself. I learned a long time ago that silence was never truly silent. Most people thought quiet meant the absence of sound, but for me it meant hearing everything. The hum of an old refrigerator 3 apartments away. The distant barking of a dog somewhere down the block. The soft vibration of rain gathering inside clouds before it even touched the ground. Ever since the accident that changed my childhood, my hearing had become unusually sharp. It was not a gift I talked about. It was not a gift anyone knew about. People assumed I struggled with hearing because I often wore an earbud in one ear and pretended to ask others to repeat themselves. It was easier that way. Easier to seem ordinary. Easier to avoid questions. That was why moving into a shared apartment with a stranger felt like a terrible idea. Rent in Seattle had become impossible, and my freelance audio editing work barely covered the essentials. When I found a room available in a beautiful apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, the price seemed too good to be true. The catch was the roommate. His name was Ronan Vale. An alpha. A successful architect. Quiet. Reserved. According to the landlord, he spent most of his time working and rarely spoke to anyone. The first time I met him, I thought he looked exactly like the city outside the window. Cold. Distant. Impossible to read. He greeted me with a polite nod, helped carry one box inside, then disappeared into his office before I could finish introducing myself. For the next several days, that became our routine. We shared the same apartment but lived separate lives. He left for work early. I worked from home. Sometimes we crossed paths in the kitchen. Sometimes we exchanged a few words about groceries or utility bills. Nothing more. Nothing personal. Nothing memorable. Then came the night everything changed. It was close to midnight. I had just finished editing a podcast and was preparing for bed when I heard Ronan's office door close. That was normal. What happened next was not. Through 2 walls and a long hallway, I heard his voice. Soft, gentle, almost unrecognizable. You made it through another day. I froze. At first, I assumed he was on the phone, but there was no response. Several seconds passed before he spoke again. I know you're tired. I know you're trying your best. My heartbeat quickened. The apartment remained completely silent except for him. No second voice. No conversation. Just Ronan speaking into an empty room. I stood motionless beside my bedroom door. You're safe now, he whispered. Nobody is going to hurt you again. The words sent an unexpected chill through me. Not because they sounded threatening, because they sounded heartbreakingly sincere, like a promise he had been repeating for a very long time. I waited for another voice, another sound, anything. Nothing came. Several minutes later, I heard his chair move. A lamp switched off. Footsteps crossed the floor. Then silence returned. Real silence this time. I lay awake staring at the ceiling long after that. Ronan Vale barely spoke to me during the day. Yet when he believed he was completely alone, he talked to someone who did not seem to exist. And for reasons I could not explain, I suddenly wanted to know who he thought he was speaking to. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. People talk to themselves sometimes. Maybe Ronan was practicing a presentation. Maybe he was recording voice notes. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation for what I had heard. That belief lasted until 3 nights later. By then, I had fallen into a routine. I worked from the dining table during the day, edited audio files for clients, and avoided bothering my roommate. Ronan remained exactly the same. Quiet, polite, distant. If anything, he seemed even more reserved than before. Yet the moment he thought he was alone, another version of him appeared. It happened shortly after midnight. I was returning from the kitchen with a glass of water when I heard his office chair shift across the floor. Then came his voice. Soft enough that most people would never notice it. Clear enough that I could hear every word. You skipped lunch again. I stopped walking. That is not taking care of yourself. Silence followed. Then he sighed. The sound carried a weight that surprised me. You always do that when you are stressed. My pulse quickened. There was no second voice. No conversation. Just Ronan speaking into an empty room. I stood frozen in the hallway. "I know you think nobody notices," he continued quietly, "but I do." Something about those words felt painfully personal. They were not the kind of things people said to strangers. They sounded familiar, intimate in the safest possible way, like concerns repeated over many years. The next morning, I paid closer attention. For the first time, I noticed small details that had somehow escaped me before. Ronan always left a cup of coffee on the kitchen counter before leaving for work. At first, I assumed it was his. Then I realized he never drank it. Every morning, the cup sat there untouched until I eventually took it. When I opened the refrigerator, I found groceries I had never purchased. My favorite yogurt brand. The exact fruit I bought every week. Even the expensive sparkling water I only treated myself to when business was good. I stared at the shelves for a long moment. Then I convinced myself it was a coincidence. It had to be. That evening, Seattle was wrapped in steady rain. I was editing sound files while Ronan worked in his office. Around midnight, his voice drifted through the walls again. "You looked happier today." I slowly removed my headphones. "I have not seen you smile like that in a long time." My breath caught. This time there was no doubt in my mind. He was talking about someone specific. Someone he knew well enough to notice changes in their mood. Someone he cared about. "I wish you could see yourself the way I do," he whispered. The room around me seemed to shrink. I should have walked away. I should have respected his privacy. Instead, I remained completely still, listening. A few moments later, I heard something unexpected. The faint sound of paper sliding across a desk. Then Ronan spoke again. "One day, I will tell you everything." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Just not yet." For reasons I could not explain, those words stayed with me long after the apartment fell silent. And for the first time, I began to wonder if the person Ronan was speaking to was not in another room. Maybe they were not somewhere else at all. Maybe the person he was talking about was much closer than either of us realized. After that night, I tried to stop thinking about it. I really did. I had deadlines to meet, clients waiting for revisions, and a growing pile of invoices that demanded far more attention than my mysterious roommate. Unfortunately, curiosity had already taken root. Every strange detail I noticed only made it worse. Over the following week, I became painfully aware of how often Ronan seemed to know things about me that I had never told him. One rainy afternoon, I spent hours struggling with a difficult audio project. By the time evening arrived, I was frustrated enough to consider giving up entirely. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen and found a note beside the coffee machine. It contained the name of a local client who specialized in the exact type of work I had been researching the night before. There was no signature, no explanation, just a website address written in neat handwriting. I stared at the note for several seconds. Ronan was the only other person living in the apartment. Yet when I thanked him later that evening, he simply looked confused. "For what?" he asked. "The recommendation." He glanced toward the kitchen. "Oh, right. I thought it might help." Then he immediately changed the subject and walked away. The interaction lasted less than a minute. Somehow it left me with even more questions than before. A few days later, I experienced another strange moment. I was returning from a grocery store several blocks away when a sudden downpour swept across the neighborhood. By the time I reached our building, I was soaked. The elevator doors opened onto our floor, and I stepped into the hallway shivering. Waiting outside our apartment door was a folded umbrella. Not expensive, not new, but dry, as though someone had left it there only moments earlier. When I entered the apartment, Ronan was sitting at the dining table reviewing architectural sketches. He never looked up. He never mentioned the umbrella. He simply continued working as though nothing unusual had happened. The situation should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt impossible to understand. That night, I remained awake longer than usual. Close to midnight, I heard the familiar sounds from his office. A chair moving, papers shifting, then his voice. "You still do that?" I quietly lowered my headphones. "You pretend everything is fine when it is not." My heart began beating faster. You have always done that. The words struck me harder than they should have. Not because they sounded emotional, because they sounded familiar, as if Ronan had spent years observing the person he was speaking about. I listened carefully. You think nobody notices. Pause followed. But I always notice. I sat frozen beside my desk. Then something happened that changed everything. For the first time since I moved into the apartment, I heard a name. Ronan spoke it so softly I almost missed it. Callum. My breath stopped. Every sound around me disappeared. The refrigerator, the rain outside, the distant traffic beyond the windows. None of it mattered anymore. I knew exactly what I had heard. My name. Not someone with a similar name. Not a coincidence. My name. Ronan continued speaking, unaware that I could hear every word. One day you will remember. His voice carried a quiet sadness I had never heard before. And when that day comes, I hope you do not hate me. I remained motionless long after the apartment fell silent. Because suddenly the mystery was no longer about a stranger Ronan missed. It was no longer about someone from his past. Somehow, impossibly, the person Ronan had been talking to all along was me. Chapter 2. The Life I Forgot. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Ronan's voice repeating the same words. One day you will remember. And when that day comes, I hope you do not hate me. By sunrise, I had convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe he was talking about someone else named Callum. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe exhaustion was making me connect things that were never connected in the first place. The problem was that none of those explanations felt believable anymore. The following morning, Ronan was already gone when I woke up. A mug sat on the kitchen counter beside a small paper bag from my favorite bakery. I stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a blueberry muffin. My favorite. Something I had never told him. The uneasiness that had been building inside me all week returned immediately. I spent the day trying to focus on work, but my concentration was gone. By late afternoon, I found myself searching through old storage boxes that had followed me through several apartments over the years. Most contained ordinary things. Tax documents, old headphones, college notebooks. Then I found a small plastic container buried beneath a stack of papers. Inside were hospital records. I had not looked at them in years. The accident had happened when I was 19 years old. I remembered that much. A vehicle collision during a winter storm outside Seattle. The details after that were always blurry. Doctors told me memory loss was normal. Family members assured me that some memories might never return. Eventually, I stopped trying to recover them. Life moved forward. Or at least I thought it had. I sat on the floor and began reading through the documents. Most were medical reports filled with technical language. Then I found something unusual. A discharge summary. Attached to it was a visitor authorization form. My eyes moved down the page. There were signatures from family members, friends, emergency contacts, and one name I did not recognize. Ronan Vale. My heartbeat instantly accelerated. I read it again, then a third time. The name remained there, clear, unmistakable. Ronan Vale had visited me repeatedly during my recovery. According to the dates, he had been there for months. I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. That was impossible. If Ronan had known me back then, why had he acted like a complete stranger when we met again? More importantly, why did I have absolutely no memory of him? The apartment door opened unexpectedly. I jumped so hard that several papers slipped from my hands. Ronan stepped inside carrying a portfolio case. His eyes immediately landed on the documents spread across the floor. For the briefest moment, his calm expression cracked. Shock flashed across his face. Then it disappeared. "What are those?" he asked quietly. I looked from the paperwork to him. Hospital records. Silence filled the room. A tension settled between us that had never existed before. Ronan placed the portfolio on the counter. "You should not spend too much time looking at old medical files." "Why not?" I asked. His jaw tightened slightly. Because some things are better left alone. The answer only deepened my suspicion. Before I could ask another question, his phone rang. Ronan glanced at the screen and immediately stepped toward the balcony. He rarely took calls in private. This time he closed the glass door behind him. I never intended to listen, but then I heard my name. No, Ronan said sharply. He still does not remember. Every muscle in my body went rigid. Pause followed. Then his voice became quieter. And I intend to keep it that way for as long as possible. For several seconds after the call ended, I could not move. The words echoed through my mind again and again. He still does not remember. And I intend to keep it that way for as long as possible. I remained hidden near the hallway until Ronan stepped back inside. His expression was calm, almost unreadable. But now I noticed something I had missed before. Beneath that calm exterior was exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. Something deeper. The kind a person carried for years. He glanced toward me briefly before returning to his work. If he suspected I had overheard the conversation, he gave no sign. Neither of us mentioned it during dinner. The silence between us felt different now. Heavy. Full of unanswered questions. That night, I waited until I heard his office door close before returning to the hospital records. There had to be more. I spent hours searching through every page. Most of the documents revealed nothing new. Then I found an old envelope tucked between two reports. The paper was yellowed with age. Inside was a photograph. My breath caught immediately. The picture showed a hospital room. I was sitting upright in bed wearing a patient bracelet. Beside me stood a young man with dark hair and serious gray eyes. Ronan. There was no doubt about it. He looked younger, but it was him. What shocked me was not his presence. It was the way he was looking at me. The photograph had captured a moment neither of us appeared aware of. I was smiling at something outside the frame. Ronan was looking directly at me. Not at the camera. Not at anyone else. Just me. The expression on his face was impossible to misunderstand. Concern. Relief. Affection. Emotions too personal to belong to a stranger. I turned the photograph over. A date had been written on the back. It matched one of the months I spent recovering after the accident. Below the date was a short handwritten note. Keep fighting. I know you can do this. The handwriting belonged to Ronan. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Why could I not remember any of this? Why had someone who clearly mattered enough to visit me for months completely disappeared from my memory? Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally forced me into bed. Sleep came quickly. Unfortunately, so did the dreams. They were not complete memories. More like fragments. Brief flashes of something lost. A snowy road. Bright headlights cutting through darkness. The sensation of cold air against my face. Then another image appeared. A hospital room. Someone sitting beside my bed. Reading aloud from a book. A familiar voice. Calm. Steady. Safe. I woke before dawn with my heart racing. The details vanished almost immediately, slipping away like water through my fingers. But one thing remained. The voice in the dream belonged to Ronan. The next morning, while making coffee, I accidentally dropped a spoon onto the kitchen floor. Before I could bend down to retrieve it, Ronan picked it up and handed it to me. Our fingers brushed briefly. A strange feeling rushed through me. Not attraction. Not fear. Recognition. As if some forgotten part of me knew him far better than the rest of me did. Ronan seemed to notice my reaction. His expression softened for the briefest moment. Then, almost sadly, he looked away. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether the person suffering most from my lost memories was not me. It was him. The feeling stayed with me for days. No matter how hard I tried to focus on work, my thoughts always returned to the same question. Who had Ronan been to me before the accident? The hospital records proved we knew each other. The photograph proved he cared about me. The phone call proved he was hiding something. Yet every time I looked at him across the apartment, he acted as though none of it existed. Almost as though he was protecting a secret too heavy to share. A week later, another piece of the puzzle appeared by accident. I was searching for an external hard drive when I noticed a storage box tucked away in the back of a hallway closet. It looked old. The cardboard corners were worn, and a layer of dust covered the lid. At first I ignored it. Then I noticed something written on the side in black marker. Recovery. My pulse immediately quickened. The handwriting was Ronan's. I knew because it matched the note on the photograph. I hesitated for several moments before opening the box. Inside were books, dozens of them, mystery novels, travel guides, audio production manuals. Every single one matched my interests perfectly. Beneath the books sat a collection of small items. A coffee mug from a local bookstore. A ticket stub from a concert I vaguely remembered attending years ago. A baseball cap with the logo of a Seattle team. None of it made sense. Why would Ronan keep a box filled with things that belonged to me? My confusion deepened when I found a notebook resting at the bottom. Most of the pages were blank. The written entries were dated during the months after my accident. I opened to the first one. Today, he remembered his favorite coffee order. The next entry read, he laughed for the first time in almost 3 weeks. Another, he finally slept through the night. I stared at the pages in disbelief. This was not a journal about himself. It was a journal about me. Every entry documented my recovery, my progress, my struggles, the smallest victories. By the time I reached the final pages, my vision had blurred. Not from sadness, from overwhelming confusion. Nobody kept records like this for a casual acquaintance. Nobody devoted this much time and attention to a stranger. A sudden noise behind me nearly made me drop the notebook. I turned around and found Ronan standing at the end of the hallway. His expression immediately hardened when he saw the box. Neither of us spoke. Several long seconds passed. Finally, he crossed the room and carefully took the notebook from my hands. You were not supposed to find this, he said quietly. Then tell me the truth. My voice sounded far steadier than I felt. Why do you have all of this? Ronan looked down at the notebook. For a moment he seemed exhausted, defeated even. Then he released a slow breath. Because after the accident, he said softly, there was nobody else. The words struck me harder than I expected. Ronan lowered his gaze. Your family lived out of state. Most of your friends moved on. The doctors were focused on your recovery. Someone had to stay. The apartment suddenly felt very small. You stayed? I asked. He nodded once. Every day. Silence filled the space between us. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Ronan finally met my eyes. Callum, he said quietly. Before the accident, we were not strangers. We were best friends. Chapter 3. The things he never said. Best friends. The words lingered in the air long after Ronan spoke them. I stared at him, searching his face for some sign that he was joking, exaggerating, or mistaken. Instead, all I found was honesty. Quiet, painful honesty. Ronan carefully returned the notebook to the storage box and lowered the lid. Neither of us seemed to know what to say next. Why didn't you tell me? I finally asked. His gaze dropped to the floor. I tried. My heart tightened. What does that mean? He released a slow breath. After you left the hospital, I tried several times. His voice remained calm, but I could hear the strain beneath it. Every time I mentioned our past, you became frustrated. Sometimes you became anxious. Your doctors warned me not to force memories that weren't ready to return. I remembered reading something similar in the medical reports. Certain memories could resurface naturally. Others could remain buried for years. So you gave up? I asked quietly. Ronan shook his head immediately. Never. The answer came so quickly that it surprised both of us. Silence followed. Then he looked away. I just stopped pushing. Later that evening, neither of us retreated to separate rooms like we normally did. Instead, we sat in the living room with cups of coffee growing cold on the table between us. For the first time since moving into the apartment, Ronan began telling me about the life I could not remember. We met during our second year of college. We worked part-time at the same campus media center. I handled audio production. Ronan designed promotional materials and architectural visualizations. According to him, our friendship started with an argument over a broken microphone. Somehow that argument turned into a conversation, then into a friendship that lasted for years. As he spoke, small fragments stirred inside my mind. Nothing complete, just feelings, familiar laughter, long nights working on projects. The comforting sense of always having someone nearby. "You were there when my father passed away," Ronan said quietly at one point. The confession caught me off guard. "I was." He nodded. "You drove across the state because you didn't want me to be alone." A strange ache formed in my chest. Not because I remembered the event, because I could not. The person Ronan described sounded like someone I wanted to know, someone I had somehow lost. The conversation continued well into the evening. Then, just as I began feeling hopeful, Ronan grew quiet. His expression changed. The warmth faded. "There is something else," he said. Instantly, I knew this was the part he had been avoiding. "What?" Ronan stared at his coffee for several seconds before answering. "The accident." Every muscle in my body tensed. "What about it?" His jaw tightened. "I was there." The room suddenly felt colder. "What do you mean?" Ronan looked directly into my eyes. The guilt I saw there was unmistakable. I was in the passenger seat. My breath caught. The fragmented dreams, the missing memories, the hospital records. Suddenly they seemed connected in ways I had never imagined. Ronan lowered his gaze. "That is the reason I hoped you would never remember everything." The confession shattered the fragile peace that had been growing between us. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. I could hear the distant rain tapping against the windows overlooking Elliott Bay. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Most of all, I could hear Ronan's uneven breathing. It was the first time since I had met him that he sounded afraid. "You were in the car," I repeated quietly. Ronan nodded once. "Yes. And you think the accident was your fault." He closed his eyes briefly. That tiny reaction was answer enough. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The guilt hidden beneath every conversation. The careful distance he maintained. The way he watched over me while pretending not to. "Tell me what happened," I said. Ronan remained silent for several seconds before answering. "We were driving back from a recording project outside the city." His voice was low and steady. It was snowing harder than expected. As he spoke, flashes stirred inside my mind. Not memories exactly, more like impressions. Headlights reflecting off wet pavement. Music playing softly through speakers. Laughter. "We were talking," Ronan continued, "about work, about the future, about things we wanted to do after graduation." He swallowed hard. Then I looked away from the road for a second. My chest tightened. "Ronan." That was all it took. The guilt in his voice was unbearable. The other driver lost control. Nobody could have prevented what happened. The police report said that repeatedly. The doctors said it. Everyone said it. He laughed softly, but there was no humor in the sound. I never believed them. The room fell silent again. For years, he had carried responsibility for something that might not have been his fault at all. Suddenly I understood why he hoped I would never recover every memory. Not because he wanted to deceive me, because he feared what I might think once I knew the truth. Later that night, after Ronan went to bed, I remained alone in the living room. My thoughts refused to settle. Around midnight, a sharp pain suddenly pulsed behind my eyes. I pressed a hand against my forehead and closed my eyes. Without warning, a memory surfaced. This time it was clearer than any dream. I was sitting inside a car. Snow drifted across the windshield. Ronan was beside me. He was laughing about something ridiculous. Then I heard myself speak. "You know I trust you, right?" The memory vanished as quickly as it appeared. I opened my eyes, breathing hard. My heart pounded against my ribs. It was only a few seconds. Barely anything at all. Yet it changed everything. Because for the first time since the accident, I had not remembered fear. I had remembered trust. And somehow that frightened me far less than the truth Ronan had been carrying all these years. The memory stayed with me for days, not because it revealed everything, but because it revealed something far more important. The person I had been before the accident trusted Ronan completely. That realization changed the way I looked at him. The distance between us slowly disappeared. Conversations became easier. Shared meals lasted longer. For the first time since moving into the apartment, the silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. Felt familiar. One evening, several weeks later, I returned home after meeting a client across town. The apartment was quiet. As I stepped inside, I heard Ronan's office door close. Instinctively, I paused. It had become a habit. For months, I had listened to the things he believed nobody could hear. Then his voice reached me once again. Soft, honest, unaware. I hope you're happy. I stood motionless in the hallway. Even if you never remember everything, I hope you're happy. The words carried none of the sadness I had heard before. Only affection, gratitude, relief. You deserved better than what happened. My chest tightened. Then he said something that made me close my eyes. And if I could choose again, I would still stay. For a long moment, I simply listened. Then I quietly walked toward the office door and knocked. Silence followed. A second later, the door opened. Ronan looked surprised to see me standing there. Callum? I smiled faintly. You know, for someone who thinks he's alone, you talk a lot. His eyes widened immediately. The realization hit him all at once. Every late night, every whispered confession, every secret conversation. I had heard them. All of them. A look of absolute horror crossed his face. You heard that? Most of them. I could not help laughing. Actually, almost all of them. For the first time since I had known him, Ronan looked completely speechless. Then something unexpected happened. A memory surfaced. Clear. Complete. I remembered sitting beside him during college finals. I remembered celebrating his first architecture award. I remembered long drives, endless conversations, and years of friendship that neither time nor memory loss had truly erased. The memories did not return all at once, but enough returned. Enough to know the truth. Tears filled my eyes before I realized it. Ronan saw them and immediately looked concerned. Callum? I shook my head and smiled. I remember enough. He stared at me. Enough. I nodded. Enough to know you never left. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then the tension that had followed us for years finally disappeared. 1 year later, we moved into a small house overlooking the water outside Seattle. My memories continued returning in fragments, but neither of us chased them anymore. We had learned that some things mattered more than remembering every detail of the past. On certain evenings, I would hear Ronan talking quietly in another room and smile to myself, because now I knew exactly who he was talking to. And this time, neither of us had to pretend otherwise.